Hi, everybody. Welcome to our exam review. This is the Exam 1 review video. So here's what's going to happen in this video. We are going to actually look at a previous exam and exam questions that I have given in the past. I've actually given these questions in the past. You're going to get the questions one at a time. If you get it right, then you'll move on to the next question. If you get it wrong, then you're going to skip to a part of the video where I explain what the right answer is, and then you'll go back to the question. These are exactly the kinds of questions that I have used in the past and the ones you should be prepared for, kinds of things that you should be prepared for on the exam. So let's go ahead and get started. Question 1. Social psychological research is a necessary endeavor because our common sense intuitions are? Yeah, all of these are true except for they're generally accurate but are held with little confidence. So common sense changes without us noticing. Yep, that happens. You don't like say, "Oh, I changed my common sense today." You don't do that, right? They're generally not accurate, and they're held with great confidence. People are really confident in their common sense, even though they don't have a whole lot of evidence for it. Are not shared as by other people as we think. So often our common sense, we think that everybody thinks that way. In reality, they don't. Often contradict each other. Yeah, they can contradict each other. Yeah, like all the time. Okay. Oh, opposites attract. Oh, birds of a feather flock together. No, those both. Yeah, can't do that. Question 2. Hot cognition is most likely associated with. In this particular case, we are talking about the heuristic route. So processing things through your emotions, right? That is more likely to be done through a heuristic route than through a systematic route, is the opposite of heuristic route. Central route is very similar to a systematic route. Affective forecasting is just predicting how you will feel if something happens, but the hot cognition means that you're using your current emotions to make a specific judgment about something. Question 3. A study may not replicate because, well, one reason is because the original study made a type 1 error. It could also be that the replication study made a type 2 error. Remember, type 1 error is when you reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true. So let's think about it. So let's say that I ran an experiment, and the experiment was, I believe that wearing glasses makes you more attractive, okay? The null hypothesis, wearing glasses, has nothing to do with it. So my original study, I concluded that wearing glasses makes you more attractive when it really doesn't. That could be what's happening. That would be a type 1 error. It could be that wearing glasses really does make you more attractive, but when somebody tried to replicate my study, they came to the wrong conclusion. They replicated the study, and they're like, "Oh, well, based on my study, wearing glasses doesn't make you more attractive," but in reality, it does. That would be a type 2 error that was made in the replication study. The reason why replication study made a type 1 error, that's not possible, is because if it didn't replicate, then they're not rejecting the null hypothesis. And you have to reject the null in order to make a type 1 error. The original study made a type 2 error. Original studies are not about null hypotheses being correct. They're about null hypotheses being rejected. So the correct answer is original study made a type 1 error, and the replication study made a type 2 error. Those are the possibilities. Question 4. Triplett's observation of bicycle races is similar to the naive scientist approach by Fritz Heider. Why? Because he was watching people and made a conclusion about what was going on. He's like, "Oh, I'm watching people, and it seems like they do better when there are other people racing against them than when they're by themselves." That is the naive scientist trying to find out why something is happening. Now, then he went off and did an actual experiment with the fishing reels, right? That wasn't naive scientist, but the observation of the bicycle race, that's naive scientist. The IAT is the implicit association task. That is a way that you measure people's implicit associations. It's not anything to do with naive scientists. Self-handicapping is when we create external attributions for our own failures. Availability heuristic is just when we make decisions based off what's available in our brain. So, naive scientists, when you're trying to find the source of information, just like Norm Triplett was in his original observation. Question 5. The IAT could be used in an experiment. Specifically, the IAT is a measurement of implicit associations, implicit bias. It is not a self-report measure. A self-report measure would be one that says, how biased are you? Tell me about it, right? Self-report about this particular concept. The IAT is not an observational measure because nobody's observing you take the IAT and that's the measurement. They're actually just recording your reaction times. That's the measurement in the IAT. The IAT is not an operationalization. Yeah, it is. It's a measurement. It's a measurement of your implicit attitudes, implicit associations. So the only correct answer is that it could be used in an experiment as a dependent variable measure. Question 6. P-hacking. P-hacking is when people do their statistics in the way they shouldn't do them. So that includes collecting more data after you've analyzed your original data. When you analyze it, you technically should stop right there. If you collect more data, then you're trying to toy with the p-values. That's called p-hacking. Including many statistical tests in your study, yeah, that's also p-hacking because you're more likely to get a statistically significant result the more studies that you do, the more measurements, right? The more measurements and statistical tests that you do. Fabricating data is not p-hacking, right? Fabricating data is just making things up. P-hacking is when you do specific things with the statistics that will help you get a p-value of less than 0.05, right? Meaning rejecting the null hypothesis. Fabricating data, that's not part of p-hacking, that's just straight fabricating data. Plagiarism, that's just stealing other people's writings, right? That's not p-hacking. P-hacking has to do with the statistics. Question 7. Based on the results of your study, let me pull this up, you conclude that eating chocolate makes people smarter. If I think that it was something else besides chocolate that made people smarter, like in your study, then I'm questioning your study's internal validity. Internal validity is when there's a question as to whether or not the independent variable is really causing the change in the dependent variable. So in this case, I'm questioning whether or not it was the actual chocolate, the independent variable, that's causing a change in smartness, which is your dependent variable. I think it's something else that's doing it. I'm questioning your internal validity. Construct validity would be something like, hey, I don't like the way that you measured intelligence, or hey, I don't like the way you manipulated how people ate chocolate. That's construct validity. External validity would be, hey, I don't think that these results apply outside of your study. Statistical validity is, hey, I don't think you ran the right statistics. Question 8. In order to determine an ought goal, I would need to have developed both the self-awareness and theory of mind. You need both of those because you need to be able to understand that you're separate from other people, right? You need to be self-aware that you are a separate entity. And you need to make sure that you know that other people have their own point of view. They can make judgments about you. That means that they would say, hey, you should be doing this. You ought to be doing that, right? Then for you to understand that they can do that, you have to have self-awareness and a theory of mind. A representative's heuristic, you don't develop that. That's a heuristic that you make a decision based on. Self-perception theory, that's when you try to understand your own attitudes based off of your own behaviors, right? How much do I like something? Oh, let me look at my behavior with that thing. Oh, yeah, I ate all the bugles, therefore I must really like bugles. Question 9. 9. There's a 9. All right. Automatic processing is most related to the peripheral route. Automatic processing is when you're not thinking, you're not using a lot of resources to process information. So peripheral route is the same as like the heuristic route. Systematic route, system 2 processing, central route, those are all effortful. Those are you using your resources to try and understand something that require a lot of controlled processing. Automatic, that'd be closer to peripheral route. Question 10. A motivated tactician. A motivated tactician, remember, this is somebody who uses their cognitive resources for what's important to them. As opposed to a cognitive miser who just don't want to use any resources at all, a motivated tactician is saying, hey, I want to use the resources for this reason and not for that reason. That's the motivated tactician. So they want to use their resources. A is the cognitive miser that uses as few resources as possible. That's cognitive miser. Only uses automatic processes. People still still process content of things. Is not influenced by the situation. That has nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it. So motivated tactician uses resources for what's important to them. 11. Cialdini and his colleagues did a study where they observed people wearing clothing with their university's logo after their football team won. This was a study on basking in reflected glory. Okay, but what they did is they just went and showed up, right? They went and showed up and just measured people after their team had won or hadn't won or had tied, right? And they didn't randomly assign the teams to win or not to win, so it was not an experiment. It was a correlational study because all they did was measured whether or not the team had won and measured whether or not people were wearing logos, were wearing the university's logo. This did not have a true independent, which is a manipulated variable. They didn't manipulate whether or not the team won, right? They would have had to what? I don't know. They would have had to rig the game if they did that, I guess. Bribe the officials. I don't know what they would have done to do that. They didn't do that. They just measured whether or not the team had won. This had only measures, right? Measure whether the team had won, measure whether you're wearing stuff with a logo on it, measure, measure. This did not have any manipulated independent variables, so the correct answer was a correlational study, had no true independent, which is a manipulated variable, and only included measures. Those are the correct ones. 12. If you ask me to avoid eating cookies rather than radishes, I will, well, according to Baumeister, I'll experience ego depletion. I'll have more difficulty with self-regulation, and I'll have constrained willpower because it's harder to not eat cookies than it is to not eat radishes. And according to Baumeister, ego depletion says that our ability to self-regulate diminishes if we use it, right? We use up that willpower, then we're going to have less of it. Self-handicapping has nothing to do with this. That's when you do a behavior that's going to undermine your performance so that you can blame it on external reasons. Nothing to do with this. Question 13. Okay, Festinger-Krauss's 1959 study was their cognitive dissonance study. That's the $1, $20 experiment. That was an experiment. They manipulated one independent variable, and that was whether or not they were paid $1, $20. That's the only thing that was manipulated. It was not a correlational study because it was an experiment. It did have a true independent variable, one of them, the $1, $20, and it included a manipulation and a measurement. Manipulation was $1, $20. Measurement was how much they liked the task. 14. A direct replication of a study is going to use the same operationalizations as well as the same conceptual variables. Both of those. It's going to be direct. It's going to be exactly the same. It is a replication because it's exactly the same. The external validity is nothing to do with the replication part. How well you do the study is the external validity question, right? It doesn't have to be a direct replication. Has nothing to do with the external validity of the experiment. So, except to maybe help it, if anything. So, great. 15. Social comparison theory requires participants to think about how they, which one I'm looking at, requires people to make judgments of their own abilities, right? So you got to figure out, hey, am I a good dancer? How do I do that? I figure it out based off of comparing myself to other people. So social comparison theory requires people to make judgments of other people's abilities, from other people's abilities. Yep. 16. Self-perception theory means that you look at your own behavior. So it requires you to think of your own behavior to figure out your attitudes about something. 17. Terror management theories, when thinking about death, causes certain reactions. So it requires you to think about your own death. That's terror management theory. And 18, self-monitoring is when you think about how you're perceived in a given situation. People who are high in self-monitoring are going to change their behaviors based off of the situation that they're in. So they might seem like a totally different person in a different situation. That's self-monitoring. 19. I keep thinking about how I should have asked a girl out to the prom. That's counterfactual thinking, right? It didn't happen. So I think about, oh, what would have been like if I had done that? That's counterfactual thinking. The availability heuristic is when you make a decision based off what's most cognitively available in your brain. The backfire effect is actually when a persuasion backfires and makes somebody less likely to believe your argument. And affective forecasting is when you predict how you are going to feel. Correct answer is counterfactual thinking. 20. There's a convention for personal trainers. You meet a woman wearing pantsuit, glasses, and a briefcase. You decide that she must be an accountant, not a personal trainer. This is an example of representativeness heuristic because you are making a judgment based off of a stereotype, right? So she kind of looks like an accountant, so you assume she's an accountant, even though the base rate would mean that people at a conference for personal trainers are most likely going to be personal trainers. This is also automatic processing. All heuristics are automatic processing. You're not actually thinking controlled. You're just making an assumption based off your heuristic. That's an automatic processing. 21. The looking glass self is most similar to social comparison theory. The looking glass self is when we try and figure out ourselves based off of what other people think about us. Social comparison theory looks at how good we are at something, what our attitudes are, based off of comparing ourselves to other people. They are both looking at trying to understand the self. Balance theory doesn't do that. Balance theory just says we want our attitudes about things and people to be balanced with each other. The IAT is just measuring your implicit associations. It's not looking at yourself. It's not trying to evaluate yourself. Terror management theory is when you think about your own death and how that might affect people. So it's not trying to make an evaluation of the self. It's just saying, hey, people act differently when they're thinking about death. 22. If children want to color a picture just because they want to, that's an example of intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation would be you pay them, you give them a sticker. It's something external to the actual act. Self-perception theory is when people behave a specific way in order to figure out their attitudes, right? So if they would say, oh, if we said, how do a child figures out how they feel about drawing by watching their behaviors, that would be self-perception theory. Self-monitoring would be that a kid acts differently at school than they do at home, was different than how they act in different places. They change their personality to kind of suit the environment that they're in. That's self-monitoring. 23. I see an advertisement for a watch. I don't need or want a watch, but the advertisement has an attractive model on it. I'm probably going to process that through heuristic or peripheral route. So heuristic is correct and peripheral is correct. So systematic and central route, those mean you're going to process it because you actually care. And you actually care about the argument of how good the watch is, not just paying attention to the attractiveness of the model selling the watch. So heuristic and peripheral are both correct. 24. Yale Communication Research Program studies were a result of World War II. They're concerned with advertising, right? They're concerned with persuasive arguments, like advertisements. They had nothing to do with the IAT. That came a lot later. It had nothing to do with heuristic. Well, it was not mostly concerned with heuristic. It was mostly concerned about the central actual content of the message is what they were really mostly concerned about, not the heuristics of it. 25. Receiver's characteristics are an example of the whom, right? It's the person receiving it, right? To whom. Who is the source characteristics? What is the message content? Whom is the receiver characteristics? 26. A heuristic is a shortcut in decision making. It's not in memory or priming. That's not how that goes. It's a shortcut in decision making. 27. Self-handicapping makes an internal attribution when I succeed, make an external attribution when I fail. It helps me fall into the self-serving bias. It helps me with all those things, right? Self-handicapping is when I do something so that I can blame my failure on an external source. So if I go out and the night before an exam, I go out and I eat 24 donuts, right? Because my roommates, take me to Krispy Kreme and they ask me to, they challenge me to do that, and I do it, and I say, oh, I feel so bad, but it's not my fault because my roommates made me do it. If I get an A+ on that exam, then I can say, wow, not only am I a genius, I'm a genius, I'm a super genius because I did it even though I was sick, all right? Even though my roommates made me sick the night before. Or if I fail, I'm like, it's not a big surprise that I failed. It wasn't my fault. My roommates made me go eat 24 donuts the night before. The self-serving bias is when good things happen to you, you make an internal attribution. When bad things happen to you, you make an external attribution. That's the self-serving bias. It does not allow you to use self-perception theory to determine your attitudes. If that was the case, what you would say is, it would be you determining whether or not you like donuts. That's not what's going on, right? That's not what's going on here. 28. Sometimes we remember and believe a message even when it comes from an unreliable source. That is called the sleeper effect. Sleeper effect. The availability heuristic is when you make a decision based on what's available in your brain. Confirmation bias is when you use information to confirm what you already believe. Unimodel is a way of processing information that is against the dual process models and says that, hey, these are all just pieces of information that I use to process this information. 29. Which of the following can be bounded? All those can be bounded, right? All of those can be bounded. Rationality can be bounded. Bounded just means that there's limitations. It's bounded. It's not, an unlimited source. That's all it means. So all of those can be bounded. 30. I like my wife. I like jelly beans. I hate Hitler. It would be balanced if my wife liked jelly beans, right? I like jelly beans. I like my wife. My wife likes jelly beans. Everything's great with my world. It would also be balanced if my wife hated Hitler. I hate Hitler. I love my wife. My wife hates Hitler. My wife and I are so agreement about Hitler. Okay? But if Hitler likes my wife, that doesn't feel right. I love my wife. I hate Hitler, and Hitler loves my wife. Oh, man, that's wrong. Hitler, get out of here. Okay? Hitler likes jelly beans. I like jelly beans, and Hitler likes jelly beans. I don't want to be in the jelly bean club with Hitler. That doesn't feel balanced. So only my wife liking jelly beans and my wife hating Hitler would be balanced. 31. Krelevine's field theory. Behavior is a function of the person by the situation. By the situation. So person by situation. All of social psychology focuses on the idea that situations are underappreciated for how much they influence us. So situation. 32. Many early social psychologists had been blank psychologists, Gestalt psychologists. Remember we talked about Gestalt psychologists? They're perceptual psychologists, and they use those things when they came over from Germany, and they used them in a social context, specifically with persuasion ideas. That's Gestalt psychology. 33. The fundamental attribution error is when people are more likely to make an internal attribution about other people's behavior. Fundamental attribution error. 34. Hazing is a good example of effort justification. So this is part of cognitive dissonance. So both effort justification and cognitive dissonance are correct because effort justification, forced choice, induced compliance, those are all paradigms of cognitive dissonance. So effort justification is cognitive dissonance. But forced choice is when you have the list of choices and, right, you give them a choice between the middle two, right? That's the forced choice paradigm. Induced compliance, that's like the $1, $20 where they have to do something that's counter-attitudinal. That's the induced compliance. So hazing is a good example of effort justification. 35. Lupe always eats kimchi. Everyone eats kimchi. Lupe does not eat other Korean foods. Lupe's behavior is high in consistency because Lupe always eats kimchi, right? When the person always does that thing, they're consistent with the same stimulus, that's consistency. Consensus, that's high because everyone eats kimchi, right? That's high consensus. Lupe does not eat other Korean foods, so Lupe is distinguishing, making a high distinction between kimchi and other Korean foods. So they're high in consistency, consensus, and distinctiveness, not high in dissonance. There's no dissonance there. 36, there it is. Lupe always eats kimchi. Everyone eats kimchi. Lupe does not eat other Korean foods. So when we're high on consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness, it leads us to an external attribution, specifically external based on the stimulus. So what we're saying is there's something about kimchi that causes Lupe's behavior, eating, right? If it was an internal attribution, we'd be saying that, kimchi just, Lupe just eats everything, right? That's just Lupe eats stuff. That's Lupe. That's her personality. That's how it goes. If it's the circumstance, then she wouldn't be eating kimchi all the time. There'd be something about a specific circumstance that would have her make her eat the kimchi because she would have to be low in consistency for that to be the case. 37. Anchoring and adjustment is a heuristic about numbers. Anchoring and adjustment is what it's called. 38. I don't feel like I'm a good athlete after I watch an NBA basketball game. This is an example of social comparison theory, right? I'm saying, hey, how good of a athlete am I? I watch NBA basketball. I'm making an upward social comparison with the basketball players, and they are better than me, so I don't feel very good about it. That's social comparison. 39. In an experiment, you always manipulate the independent variable and then measure the dependent variable. In an experiment, you have to manipulate the independent variable. If you don't have an experiment. You must manipulate the independent variable. 40. We discussed in class why some people think that Hitler was the person who most influenced social psychology. So Adolf Hitler is the answer to that question. Hitler is the answer. Not because he's a social psychologist, but because he kicked a lot of psychologists out who became social psychologists, and because he caused a lot of things for us to study. Okay, I hope that was helpful for everybody. Good luck.